Welcome to the Armenian News Network Groong Week in Review for September 29, 2024. Folks, we are recording this episode on September 30th, and 377 days have passed since the disastrous war of September 2023, which culminated in the complete ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. 150,000 Armenians were dispossessed of their homes and their land. Dozens of Armenians, including the military political leadership of Artsakh, remain still in Azerbaijani captivity, and their suffering continues to be met with widespread indifference by global governments, unfortunately including the regime in Yerevan. Today we're talking with Hrant Mikaelian. Welcome back, Hrant. Good to have you on our show.
Ողջույն, Hrant.
Thank you for having me.
Hrant, last week marked the 4th anniversary of the beginning of the 44-day war, which culminated a year ago with the complete ethnic cleansing of Artsakh by Azerbaijan. I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts about this difficult day in our modern history?
Well, before going to 2020, I would like to elaborate a little bit on September 27, 2024, and mainly what did not happen instead of what happened. So, first of all, we did not have any silence minute or something like that. For example, in Azerbaijan, there have been a footage that they have stopped all the cars, they have pushed for signals and so on. So they marked the moment of September 27, 2020. So, by the way, when I've been in Artsakh, one of the last times, it was September 27, 2022. It was the same situation in Stepanakert. So Artsakh was mentioning this date, but Yerevan does not want to remember that date. That's the first thing to consider. Second thing to consider is that 4 years passed, but no official investigation has taken place. By the way, this government has stated that they are planning to create a commission to investigate the outcome of wars, the reasons, and how the war was governed by the current government. But nothing happened. 4 years passed, but nothing happened. And by the way, in the expert community, we also see very little debate on that. And mostly there are some, differentiating segments. Some of them are pro-government, which reproduce the pro-government stance. Some are neutral, and some are pro-opposition. But what is important that there is no developing discourse. By what I mean, the new studies on what happened. So basically what has been known in 2020 is just being republished or discussed again. No new information appears, which I view as a problem, because in reality, I think there is a lot of things we need to know about that war. So regarding the war itself, now going back to 2020, I think, of course, it was a disaster. It marked, at least partial collapse of statehood of Armenia, because Armenia, as a third republic, was born in the Karabakh movement since 1988, and 2020 to 2023 have marked the complete collapse of Artsakh, of Armenian Artsakh, and that is huge because by territory Artsakh was like 1/3 of modern of Armenia in the Soviet borders. That's first. Second, huge demographic losses for Armenia, at least. Then we can look at economic losses and political losses, because now, for example, Armenia's diplomatic stance is weak as ever. And then the, let's say, long-term losses, by which you can understand everything. And now Armenia is in the security vacuum. So I think this war was a complete mess. Now, another sub-question you had, what has been done wrong? And it depends on the intentions, because based on the further statements by the leader of current Armenian government, Pashinyan, we can judge that Armenia losing that war and going towards integration in Turco-Azerbaijani space, let's say, political, economic, and so on, was his goal. And if we judge by his articles published in his newspaper, back in 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, we can understand that in reality, this was his goal from the very beginning. So in reality, he has done nothing wrong based on his intentions, and his intentions were to make Armenia to lose this war, and he did that deliberately.
And of course, he said, I could have ended the war on the day it began, but it was going to be the same result except 5,000 losses. So it seems like he consciously is aware that he needed to pay the price of 5,000 men in order
to justify the outcome.
Exactly.
Because I've talked to some of the generals of Armenian army, to some of the representatives of other, let's say, power ministries, as they say in the post-Soviet space. So most of them are convinced that Armenia could have, if not won this war, at least could have had relatively good peace. Maybe losing 5 districts of Soviet Azerbaijan, but still having Nagorno-Karabakh and 2 more districts which are connecting Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh. So all in all, at least 7 or 8,000 square kilometers will be still under Armenian control. That's most probably the worst case scenario if everything had been done properly. Now, the situation we have now is the result of the policy. And again, I'm saying that this is deliberate policy because based on policy which have been conducted since then, and not only that, based on statements and based on the information which is published and which is not published. But anyway, the sole most important thing which affected the outcome of war was unpreparedness. Now, unpreparedness is coming from ignoring the signals about the war, because there have been numerous signals starting at least since October 2019 and escalating since June 2020, and official notification from Russia on September 1st, 2020, at least from what we know. So ignoring all those signals and having unprepared army that got hit, soldiers being sleeping
surprised.
and hit by, surprised. That was huge mess. But afterwards, there have been also several catastrophic mistakes, such as, for example, Lele-Tepe counteroffensive, non-building new defensive lines, and so on and so forth. And very poor participation of Armenian army in the combat, in the contrary to Nagorno-Karabakh army. So Armenian army was kind of splitted, and some of it did not participate, while another part did participate in the war. So that's another thing. So there are many things to investigate, but all in all, it completely depended on the Armenian government how to manage this situation, and the outcome is the result of their policy. That's for sure.
Hrant, some of the reasons which you gave are exactly why I have called this an engineered defeat on the part of Pashinyan. But look, after September 27, 2020, we had 2 more wars. There was one in Gegharkunik in 2021 and another one in Jermuk in 2022. And we suffered hundreds of dead in those attacks also. So we are continuing to be threatened by war every time. Like even in 2024, Pashinyan was saying that if we don't give up Kirans and other parts of Tavush, there will be a war. So these threats continue. Has the war even ended?
Well, let's say, add up to your picture. Yes, we had clash in Gegharkunik in November 2021, Gegharkunik and Sunik. But also we had in the same areas, we had a clash in May 2021, but given that Armenian army has shown no resistance and Azerbaijanis took territories without casualties, many people do not remember this as a war, but basically it was because Azerbaijanis advanced in very important directions. Third, as you mentioned, was September 2022 in Jermuk. Fourth was attack on Artsakh in September 2023, But in addition to all of that, we can remember several other acts when Azerbaijan is attacked. For example, they took a mountain near near Kapan. There have been some other incidents. For example, in September 2021, they took territory between Goris and Kapan, after which Iran was ready to take part in a war. They have conducted a military exercise on the border with Armenia and Azerbaijan, and several other incidents. So basically, war never ended, that's for sure. And by the way, just one incident, for example, September 2022 incident near Jermuk. Of course, it was not only Jermuk, it was also near Kinhand, it was in Gerharkunik as well, but Jermuk was the main area. Armenia had some 230 casualties that days. Azerbaijan had practically the same numbers. But what is important is that the amount of casualties on Armenian side is more or less equal or a bit higher than Georgia suffered in 2008. And we'll remember how big geopolitical clash it was back then, because the West was involved, and how very few people took care about it when it was just Armenia. I mean, in the West, and not only in the West. So basically, I think Armenia is left alone, unfortunately, and suffers non-stop aggression. And by the way, when Pashinyan has surrendered some territories to Aliyev in May to June 2024 in near Kiran's village in Tavush, again, he was telling that if he is not giving those lands, there will be a war. So basically, it was also act of a war, but just without shooting. So basically, the war has never ended. Moreover, another risk of war is connected to the ecology summit, which has to be taken in Baku. So many speculate that just because Azerbaijan needs a good, let's say, political situation for all guests to arrive and to preserve its image, just because of that, they are keeping the military activity low. But this does not mean that the situation has de-escalated.
Hrant, we earlier talked about the lack of an investigation, the lack of an independent investigation, a public one, and a thorough one. There has been a sham of an investigation in the Armenian parliament, in the Defense and Security Committee, which I believe the opposition members boycotted because it was essentially controlled by civil contract. The entire parliament obviously is controlled by civil contract. They have almost constitutional majority, probably. Yeah, and also structurally, this committee would only be able to investigate the conduct of the armed forces and security forces, and not, the conduct of the entire state and the political choices or decisions that led to this war, and the conduct during the war, and sort of policies after the war. But even this committee has not released its findings to the public, and from what I'm understanding, it never will. That goes to just underscore that essentially we are blind to what happened still 4 years after the fact, like you said before. And I want to ask you something that I've heard repeatedly stated and alleged. Is it true that on the third or fourth day of the war, public mobilization in Armenia essentially stopped? And then the stance of the Pashinyan and the stance of the government changed to encourage people to join these voluntary units, apparently controlled by the village elder. So people could go to their village elder and say, I want to volunteer to go fight. They would get a couple of days of training. They would be poorly equipped, based on my understanding and based on my reading of all of these reports. And they would be sent to essentially fight a modern army, armed with to the teeth with the most technological weapons, and also the training that they have to fight, in unison and as part of a whole entire armed forces. Essentially, Armenians didn't have that, and I'm just dumbfounded why. But is it true that basically on the third or fourth day of the war, mobilization in Armenia was stopped?
Well, what you are saying is not a secret, because Pashinyan has been encouraging people to go to fight, to form voluntary units. Mm, Officially, it was his official statement. So it's not something you need to, dig in very deeply. I remember that very clearly. And yes, the mobilization effort has also stopped. Not only mobilization effort, because from the beginning, many people came to military units and asked to mobilize them. So even those people were not mobilized. So it was completely disorganized event. Now, regarding the internal investigation, I think that just like these modern statements about the coup attempt in Armenia, I think this is a very weak investigation. I cannot even call this investigation, because if they are not bringing this to public, they know that they cannot prove anything. It's so at the point when we will have something to discuss, something open to public, then we can call it an investigation. Otherwise, it's just an internal, let's say, debate within the current state apparatus, nothing else. So I think, but besides the government, unfortunately, opposition or other groups, let's put aside political groups. For example, unions of officers and so on, they could make their own investigation. Artsakh could have made its own investigation. Unfortunately, no one did. So it's not only about government. And this is the big reason why we're in this situation. It's not only the government which is pushing its policy, but it's no one who is doing something else.
Ranjan, we will cover this a little bit later as well, because we're going to be talking about the budget. But when November 9-10 statement was signed, defenders of Nikol Pashinyan said, well, this is a prudent and pragmatic decision to do. Let's wait 5 more years and rebuild the military so that we can sort of come back with force. And we're seeing that at every step, we're losing more and more. And the main question to ask is Armenia even rebuilding its military, or has military balance been restored? Because if you ask those same supporters of Nikol Pashinyan, they will say that, look at the budget, it's $1.7 billion. Surely, we're making progress. So I want to ask you, is Armenia rebuilding its military, and has military balance been restored with Azerbaijan?
We have good experience of overspendings with this government. So if they are spending money, it does not mean they are making progress. That's first and very important. Second, if we compare it to the previous years, we will barely see a major budget back then. But, major military imports was, let's say, unofficial and was not transparent. And the numbers were really big. What we have now is a completely different situation. First, military structure and infrastructure has not been restored. Discipline in army is insufficient, or let's say even more poor. Border infrastructure is very poor. But the main thing is...
Yeah, those are things that are visible to the naked eye. So those are things that we can actually judge without, looking into top secret documents, right?
Yeah, but major thing is to which extent the army is capable of conducting its own operations or fulfilling its goals. So the goal is providing the security to Armenia and providing the government, let's say, or the state with the possibility to pursue its own policy. Now, if a prime minister says that the very next day there might be a war if we don't, give up some territories, this means that he considers, at least he himself, considers that army is incapable of resolving these issues. Another thing is that if we look at the staff policy, we can see that many capable generals have been removed from the army, and many of those who are just politically loyal have improved their positions, and so on and so forth. So we did not have a proper personnel policy even before 2018, but since then, those who have not been loyal, and those have been usually the people who understood the critical situation and tried to improve something. And those have been removed from army, and only those who are loyal, have no initiative, and are just political appointees are now in army on top positions, which indicates that military personnel policy is very poor. And this also means that in case of trouble, we might have big problems in that as well. I mean, in management and in all that stuff. So anyway, I'm sure that Armenian army is today much weaker than in 2020, and that is why Pashinyan will have to make new concessions, but he does not want to rebuild the Armenian army, or is incapable. Now, when we are talking about increased military budget, first of all, if we are talking about the military imports or military technical imports, most of this new equipment even did not arrive to Armenia. Most of the equipment from France, from India did not arrive to Armenia. But another thing is that the supply routes are very poor, because if there is a war, Georgia will have to close the roads because it's afraid of Azerbaijan and Turkey. Exactly. And Armenia will not have proper supply from France, at least. Maybe Indian weapons can come to Armenia through Iran, but since we do not have military cooperation with Iran, and we have stopped military cooperation with Russia, and we are very highly dependent on French route, which is questionable during the war, I think we will be in trouble. So basically, I think in every component, Armenia is now weaker than in 2020. And also, the amount of weapons which have been destroyed in 2020 and since then has not been restored in the army. So now Azerbaijan has acquired much more new military equipment than Armenia.
Hrant, so in this context, the Armenian-Azeri talks continue still. There's a lot of pressure by the US on the sides to agree on a deal which they think, or they hope, will greenlight Turkey's opening its border and relations with Armenia. So on the occasion of the UN General Assembly last week, everybody was in New York. Pashinyan peddled his brand of impotent pacifism at the UNGA, while Aliyev was actually at home and addressed his parliament and said Azerbaijan will continue its military buildup. And he also rejected Pashinyan's proposed piecemeal peace deal and said Pashinyan should not delay resolving his outstanding issues still. For example, the Zangezur corridor that they demand through Armenia, and also a change of the constitution. In the meantime, Pashinyan met with Erdogan in New York, not at the UN building. He actually went to the Turkish consulate in the so-called Turkish House skyscraper. And there are some reports from Turkish experts indicating that Pashinyan may have asked Erdogan to intercede in the negotiations with Aliyev, but instead Erdogan simply reiterated that a corridor is being demanded and he has to come through for that.
The most surreal moment for me, Aspet, was at the end of that meeting where Erdogan gave a gift to Pashinyan, the book that he authored. And the title of the book is called A Fairer World is Possible. I mean, that in itself is surreal, but the fact that Pashinyan was clinching that book to his chest and grinning
like ear to ear, if you see the picture.
Best day of his life. That was I don't know how people handle that, but you know, since Erdogan wrote the book, Hrant, A Fairer World is Possible, what is Erdogan's vision for a fairer world in the Caucasus?
Erdogan's vision of fair world in the Caucasus is a world without Armenia, completely without Armenia. Not even just with the corridor, but just without Armenia. That's first. Second, that photo made many people angry. And by the way, this is not the only photo that will be remembered, because we have also a photo of Pashinyan meeting with Aliyev, where Aliyev is smiling and Pashinyan is in bad mood, and some other photos like that. Anyway, what can I say? The thing is that Pashinyan has met on, let's say, Turkish territory. It was not even on neutral territory. The meeting is also saying, we can also remember how Armenia has recognized Palestine, and then immediately Turkey has stated that they will continue efforts to make other states recognize Palestine. So let's say by that they were saying that it was their effort to make Armenia recognize the Palestine state. Another thing is that US is trying to push Armenia to, let's say, come to an agreement, but I think US is seeking for the keys of peace in a wrong place. Those keys are not in Yerevan, those are in Ankara, but unfortunately, US either does not have sufficient power to push Ankara for negotiations, for fair negotiations, or does not want to spend that political capital. Anyway, yes, they want to have any kind of agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan that will be called peace treaty, and that's the same that Pashinyan wants right now. So they want just a paper on which there will be written a peace treaty, but they are not going to get it because Aliyev says, if we did not agree on everything, we did not agree on anything. And as Pashinyan has said previously, there have been 13 articles out of 18 agreed, and then US proposed to remove some articles regarding the transportation and probably corridor to another treaty. And since then, they started talking that 13 out of 16 articles have been agreed. But the thing is that you cannot come to an agreement on the issues which do not imply the agreement at all. So basically, we cannot have an agreement in this area because Azerbaijan's issues cannot be met by just peaceful talks. So these talks are not going to yield any results in foreseeable future, and the issues which Azerbaijan is putting can be resolved only with the military means, and this is where we are heading in reality.
Hrant, so do you think that the talks are at a dead end here?
For sure. From the beginning, they were there. And all the statements that we were very close to final agreement and so on, I have been listening to this kind of stuff even during the Karabakh talks since 90s, since 2000s, and so on and so forth. And the same thing I hear now. But on Azerbaijani side, we hear that the agreement is not prepared, that they have many issues, and then Turks who are saying that they need corridor and so on.
And as you, I think, rightly said, Hrant, the key lies with Ankara. You have previously said that, in fact, Baku is very much, for issues that are important to Ankara, Baku is essentially in the role of a...
They're the tool, they're the hammer.
Or in the role of a implementer of a policy rather than a dictator of the policy. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's more than correct. Azerbaijan is not a sovereign state. Azerbaijan is a puppet state to Turkey. And unfortunately, they do not understand it in Russia. And most probably, they do not understand it in European Union, in Brussels as well. Maybe they do understand it in United States because they have a long history of relations with Turkey, including military and security relations. But anyway, they are not capable or not willing to spend too much energy and capital on pushing Ankara towards more constructive stance.
So on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, a trilateral meeting of the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers with Secretary Antony Blinken was held, and it seemed to yield no immediate discernible result. Can you tell us what the progress on that front was? Was there any recorded progress from the meeting with Blinken?
From what we can gather from the public official statements in Armenia, in reality, it was rather regress than progress, because they wanted to, let's say, make a diplomatic push. Armenians and Americans wanted to make a diplomatic push towards Azerbaijan that, okay, we have done this, we have done that, now it's your turn, everything is prepared, let's go towards peace. But it did not work with Azerbaijan. And Aliyev said, no, I'm not going to do that. And this became apparent to everybody right now. So the so-called peace agenda is falling apart. And this is a big issue. So For this government, it's more and more obvious that even with all the concessions they are ready to make, they are not going to get any peace deal. That's why I think this visit to US was a failure for us, for Pashinyan, and also there are some rumors that Pashinyan wanted to have any kind of agreement with Aliyev and include the proposition of peace in his speech in the UN General Assembly. But since the negotiation was unsuccessful, he had to, remove this part. So basically, I think this visit was failure for Pashinyan.
So as you're saying, essentially, Ceyhun Bayramov was the top representative of Azerbaijani foreign policy there. Aliyev didn't go. And in response to Pashinyan's speech, Bayramov repeated Azerbaijan's rejection of a partial peace treaty and reconfirmed that Armenia must change its constitution. In the meantime, Pashinyan says that the Armenian constitution does not contain claims on Azerbaijani territory, but in fact, it's the Azerbaijani constitution that makes claims to the Armenian territory. However, he says he doesn't bring up this problem because he wants to move towards peace, and the peace agreement itself would supersede domestic law. Essentially, is Pashinyan correct to argue this point?
Well, of course, if you go into Declaration of Independence of Azerbaijan, which claims to be restored the First Republic of Azerbaijan, which had a claim of almost whole territory of Armenia, then we have a problem. And by the way, it's not just an implicit claim. Aliyev himself and all his state apparatus is repeating it. So they are repeating the claims of most of the Armenians' territory, including Yerevan. So I think in this matter, Pashinyan is right. But at the same time, he did not exclude the possibility of constitutional change in Armenia as well. He said there is no need in that, but he does not include that. So, and by the way, the Constitutional Court has also held a meeting on the process with Azerbaijan. I mean the border process, let's say, and they approved it. We can remember how Pashinyan unconstitutionally took over the Constitutional Court in 2020 just for that. So now we can be sure that at some point they might approve a constitutional change as well. But the problem is that Pashinyan might not be able to change the constitution, because for that you need a public vote.
Referendum, yeah.
Yes, and in that referendum, Pashinyan is not going to get 50+% for the change of constitution. According to opinion polls, majority is against. Again, you can try to combine it somehow with some other issues. For example, now they are preparing or discussing, let's say, referendum on EU accession of Armenia. But anyway, I do not see how Pashinyan is going to get the constitutional change without violation of law. Of course, he is capable of that as well. But anyway, if we do not include this as a part of the equation, he is not going to get that. And that is what he is telling to Aliyev, that this might have a big political price for him. But there are rumors that Pashinyan also wants to have an election prior to their date, which normally should be in June 2026. But many moves of Pashinyan indicate that he is preparing to a new election, which might be in the, let's say, first half of 2025, which, by the way, his friend Aliyev does as well. Aliyev is moving every election ahead by 1 year or so. So I would not exclude that Pashinyan will do the same. So constitutional change is a major trouble for Pashinyan. But by the way, it's also not the only demand by Aliyev. Aliyev has many demands, including disbanding the the Minsk group, and some other requirement.
In fact, yes, we're not hearing about some of the demands, but they're like you could hear the echo of them in the background. For instance, the former foreign minister talked about paying reparations, and if Armenia can't pay reparations, then they will take territory and so forth as payment. So, and of course, all these echoes about demilitarization of Armenia, repopulation of Armenia with Azerbaijanis, all those things are still, we're not even touching the surface of those. We're not even scratching the surface of those demands. And I think willfully, maybe willingly, it's so painful it's to consider that. I mean, maybe it's so far-fetched to consider today that we are consciously ignoring that. But in reality, is it possible that those are also demands that are not yet being voiced, but Pashinyan has somehow acquiesced to those, or essentially he has received those demands and he's trying to figure out how to maneuver around those?
Right, you are correct. In reality, those demands list is very long, and its goal is to destroy the Armenian statehood completely. Let's imagine Iran is demanding America's constitution, change of America's constitution, and in fact, Iran is writing constitution for the United States. What will remain from the United States after that? That is the same if we are discussing, let's say, Armenia's constitutional change under the Azerbaijani dictate. So in reality, just the constitutional change itself will mean that Armenia is already a subordinate state to Azerbaijan, not even Turkey. So I think just that is enough. So Azerbaijan wants to destroy Armenian state. Pashinyan wants, you are very correct here, Pashinyan wants to maneuver. But if you do not have a long-term policy, if you do not build up your security and foreign relation policy in a proper way, and the policy of personnel, both in the ministries and in the military and all over, you have no chance. Yeah, so I think Armenia is under critical risk right now.
Hrant, I'm also concerned about this reliance of not raising certain issues for the sake of peace because the peace agreement supersedes domestic law statement that we've heard from Pashinyan. What happens if Armenia changes its constitution per Aliyev's demand, removing alleged claims to Azerbaijani territory? Obviously, this is a demand aimed to legitimize the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, right? And the dispossession of the Armenians with international legal basis so that they can point to Armenia's constitution and say, so you have nothing to demand from Azerbaijan, and you are saying so.
And you are the aggressor. You have been the aggressor all these 30 years. Now it's formal. You have, give us reparations.
Yeah, and after Azerbaijan, and afterwards, after Armenia has done all of these things, Azerbaijan simply tears the so-called peace agreement and returns to claim Armenian territories because its constitution says so. Where does that leave Armenia? With absolutely no legal basis to do anything.
Well, Azerbaijani demands towards Armenian constitutions are not limited to the territorial issue. They want more. They want to ban, for example, any anti-Azerbaijani statement, any structural groups which may be against, let's say, the current status quo. So this might imply, and by some statements, we know that this does imply banning the Dashnaq Tutun Party, the Armenian Church, and many other structures. So, in fact, they want to destroy anything which is not subordinate towards Azerbaijan, destroy free speech in Armenia, and changing constitution, and then they will require changing flag and so on. I mean, this whole takes us to the bottom. I do not want even to continue discussing it because Azerbaijani's requirements are just ridiculous, all of them, and nothing should be discussed. In reality, when you are in negotiation, the more questions you are raising, the more problems you are raising, the stronger your position is. If you, on your side, are not raising some issues, just in the sake of, touching an agreement, but your counterpart does not do the same, this means that you are giving your counterpart a leverage. in this case, you are giving your enemy a leverage against you. This is what Pashinyan is doing in these negotiations, and he just declares this. I mean, not stating about problems is already a problem.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Related to all this, on September 22nd, I believe, Bakrat Srbazan held a gathering to relaunch the Tavush for the Homeland movement he started back in April. I wanted to know what your impressions were of this event, as we all read about it, but I don't know exactly how you feel about it. And does it look like this movement is ready or even ramping up to apply popular pressure on the government to not go forward with further mistakes or unilateral concessions?
Well, that meeting gathered some 7,000 to 7,500 people, and it's not much, given that there was huge organizational effort to call all the people who could potentially participate there, including personal invitations. So I think it's not much. Now, the problem is that economy is still in a good shape. Socially, beginning of September is a busy period. Children start going to school. People are going back from vacations. So September was completely politically passive time. But October does not differ much because not much has changed since then. So at this point, I think the potential for mass protest is not high. Of course, just presence of this movement changes status quo in Armenia. First of all, the opposition now has control of the streets. Anyway, it's not the government anymore, it's opposition. And this, for example, if you listen to the opposition representatives, they say that they are not able to stop Pashinyan from, fulfilling his unilateral concessions policy, but they are slowing it down very significantly. And I will tend to agree with that because many things Pashinyan has stated before, he did not do yet, including, by the way, the constitutional change as well. Because yet in the late January this year, he stated that Armenia needs change of constitution for the first time, just after Aliyev started demanding that. So I think this creates an, let's say, self-institutional constraint to Pashinyan. But anyway, at this point, I do not see how opposition is able to change the situation in the country, how it is able to restart the mass protest activity. And so I would rather bet that, it will be just a, let's say, low-level political activity. But even that is important just because Pashinyan needs an alternative, needs a visible alternative. And even if it is like this, it should be preserved. That's what I can say. But anyway, I do not see how the status quo in the country is changing.
Okay, I'm going to turn our attention to our final topic, which is that last week the parliament approved the government's draft 2025 budget of about $9 billion. I've put a lot of numbers in the show notes, so please click on the show notes, folks, podcasts.groong.org/the episode number, and you'll see the numbers and references and things like that. So this is a $9 billion budget of revenues and expenditures, and it includes a budget deficit of $1.5 billion. Economic growth is projected to be about 5.5% and inflation rate of 3.5%. And it also includes a 20% growth in the defense budget to become, as we mentioned earlier, $1.7 billion in 2025, as compared to Azerbaijan's projected $3.9 billion in 2025. Hrant, what are your thoughts about this budget? And also, given that the government has a dismal record of hitting its targets, both in expenditures as well as revenues, do these targets look reasonable to you?
You have a good point here. First of all, government did not fulfill the 2024 budget as well. So I have no reason to expect the 2025 budget to be met as well. That's the first issue. Second, the planned budget deficit of $1.5 billion, I think it is high. I think it is really high for the period when there is no crisis. Of course, Armenia has to return some debts, and to some extent, this deficit is connected to those payments. But anyway, I think this is too high and not too responsible. Another thing is that increasing, one thing is when there was a plan of increasing budget incomes after the government change in 2018, based on changing of administration levels and intensity. And at that time, it did work out, although not as expected, not as high as expected, but some effect was there. But how Pashinyan is going to increase the tax to GDP ratio in 1 year, given that there is no governmental change this time, I cannot understand. And moreover, now we see that tax administration has become, kind of oppressive. They are demanding from businesses to pay ahead, and they are trying to tax everyone. They are checking on the borders, everyone, especially who is coming from the United States, trying to find something which has been brought but not brought to the customs. But anyway, even with all those policies, which, by the way, makes business nervous, and we have had several statements, including statement by Hrant Mikaelian, who is president of Business Club Mantashev, or Mantashans to be correct. So we have all these, trends, but this will not lead to significant change of tax to GDP ratio. As of now, Armenia has no potential of significant tax income increase.
Yeah, they're claiming that they are going to improve by
25%. Am I right?
Yes, that you're absolutely right. And here's how they're going to do it. Quote, improvements in tax administration, fight against shadow economy, as well as other tax policies, unquote.
Well, according to my calculations, as of now, Armenia's shadow economy is somewhere around 11 to 12%. So there is no real potential of going down this figure. So I do not believe they will be able to increase tax income to this significant margin. Moreover, the anticipated economic growth of 5.6% in surplus with 3.5% consumer price index. So it's, let's say, all in all, it's 9% growth, which can be anticipated in reality instead of 25. This cannot be fulfilled as well, most probably, because if Russian-Ukrainian war will end, which I hope will happen next year, then Armenia will lose its role of, let's say, intermediate trade partner for, let's say, Russia and some other countries who are trading with Russia, including some European countries, who also do that. Anyway, I think this role will be less and less demanded, and that will mean that Armenia's economy will suffer a bit. Another problem might be that world economy might not be in its best shape in 2025. That we don't know for sure. There are some signals which indicate that. There are some other signals. Anyway, 5.6% is too ambitious based on high economic growth in the previous years, let's say 2022 to 2024. So I'm not sure we will be able to have this growth.
Hrant, are the government's calculations continuing to include the re-export factor into the GDP number? Because when they say that next year the national debt to GDP is going to be 53.5%, is that with the inflated GDP number that includes re-exports? Because if these things go away, as you said, after the war in Ukraine, and Armenia's GDP essentially tanks, let's say, then suddenly the debt to GDP will be extremely high, which will affect Armenia's international ratings, such as Standard & Poor's, etc. And suddenly there could be serious financial consequences to the country.
It will depend on dram to dollar rate. Because before the Russian-Ukraine war, $1 costed 500 drams. Now it's 388. So that difference is based on influx of approximately $200 million to Armenia, which stays in Armenia, and ultimately, improves Armenia's payment balance and increases Armenia's dram rate towards dollar. And that is why Armenia's GDP in dollar is increased by a significant margin. Now, if Armenia's GDP will decrease based on changed currency rate, that might change as well, but by not that significant amount. For example, this 53% might turn into 60 or 62, but not more. So that should not be a very big concern of us. But anyway, this should be taken into consideration that yes, share of debt towards GDP has decreased just because Armenia's dram has appreciated towards dollar.
Okay. It seems like I'm more concerned about that one issue than most economists and finance people. So we recently discussed with economist and former Minister of Finance Vartan Aramian, who expressed concern that consumer debt, especially due to home mortgages, is rising at an alarming rate because their income is not really keeping pace with their debt. What's fueling all this borrowing, and is it government-promoted modus vivendi?
Regarding the growth of mortgage loans, the picture is very clear. Since 2025, there is a law under which you can buy a property or apartment in a building which is built right now, and the government is paying you your loan percentage. So that is why there is a rush of many people who are able to make a first payment, because since 2025 they will not be able to do that. And as of now, the primary market in Yerevan is overheated. It is overheated, but that will end with 2024. So I do not see any concern here apart from budget overspending in next few years, just because of that regulation.
All right. Well, let's wrap up our topics here, Hrant. And now it's time for me to ask each of you if there's been something on your mind in the past week or month that you want to talk about. Hrant, what's on your mind?
Well, on September 29, Armenian Church has held an official ceremony of reopening of the Echmiadzin Cathedral, and they have invited their government officials, including those whom they demanded to resign. So Armenian Church has demanded Armenian government to resign, but they have called them to participate. And some of them came to participate just for a short period of time, but at least they got something out of it. And some opposition representatives declared they will not participate in this event just because government representatives will be there. This shows for me that church is still afraid of the government and is not ready to stand on its demands of governmental change. And I think this is also important indicator of internal situation. But anyway, I don't think that church versus state conflict will be overcome in the next several months. Mm-hmm. So despite the church is trying to let's say dig itself out of this situation and trying to distance itself from Bagrat, Srbazan. But anyway, I don't think it will work out.
Hovik, what's on your mind?
And I also want to ask diplomats, members of the foreign ministries who are following us to really consider, I understand that your state, your government has its own cold calculations whether it is to allow this climate conference to happen or for Azerbaijan to ethnically cleanse Karabakh without any repercussions whatsoever, or to this day hold dozens of Armenian prisoners and hostages. Look, I understand your cold calculations of what you need to do in order to protect your state interests or whatever. But is it too much to ask that when it comes to the policy of holding hostages, that you do a little bit more to get those hostages released? Again, Azerbaijan has dozens of Armenian hostages. Some of the military political leadership of Artsakh is in that group. They are icons for Armenians. And holding them in such a humiliating way is a huge affront to the dignity. And you keep in your statements, there is mentions of dignity or dignified return and so forth. Well, why don't you start with just, doing a little bit more to release Armenian hostages in Baku? Is that too much to ask?
All right, we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you, Hrant, for joining us.
Thank you, Hrant.
Thank you, Aspet. Thank you, Hovik.
That was our Weekend Review show recorded on September 30th, 2024. We've been talking with Hrant Mikaelian, who is a political scientist and multidisciplinary researcher in social sciences based in Yerevan. He's also a senior researcher at the Caucasus Institute. For more on the participants in this episode, please visit our show notes at podcast.groong.org/episode number.